Bitcoin is becoming a top 5 or, probably top 5, definitely top 10 globally saleable money.
And so in those environments, basically Bitcoin becomes very interesting, and there's more of an incentive.
As the foundations of the old world crumble beneath the weight of systemic flaws, Alden's rallying cry resounds, beckoning weary souls towards the boundless possibilities of Bitcoin.
I think the prior cycle was instructive on this because, for example, Bitcoin formed a very big bottom in late 2018, early 2019, and then it grinded significantly higher. But then it kind of retested that bottom very briefly during the March 2020 sell-off. And so it didn't hit like lower lows, but it did kind of briefly go back and plumb those depths. And the difference was that it didn't stay there for many months.
Where financial sovereignty and liberation await those brave enough to embrace its disruptive embrace. In a world ravaged by inflationary pressures and economic uncertainty.
And imagine you're a country and basically another country can dictate your monetary policy for you. That's kind of the world we live in. And what Bitcoin comes around and does and says, here's an alternative. It's new, it's volatile, it's poorly understood, but it doesn't change its monetary policy based on the decision of a handful of people in a room.
Alden's enlightening perspective unveils the siren song of Bitcoin, an instrument of financial emancipation that promises to shield the masses from the ravages of devaluation and provide sanctuary in the storm.
And I think what the importance of Bitcoin is basically a computer science breakthrough that changes how we interact with money at the root layer. Basically, it's open source money, it's global money, it's decentralized money in basically a cloud. You can access it around the world, you can send it around the world, and that's a very powerful concept that is very different than decades of basically fintech innovations.
Against the backdrop of a broken monetary paradigm, Alden's captivating narrative reverberates, shining a spotlight on the inevitability of a mass exodus towards Bitcoin, as the disillusioned and disenchanted seek solace in the digital fortress that transcends borders and intermediaries.
Next 6 months for Bitcoin, very unclear. I can make the case for retesting the lows, or I can make the case for not going below 25,000. But that I think that the 2-year or the 3-year case is very, very strong. I have high conviction that basically we'll probably have another positive liquidity cycle.
As the global economy teeters on the brink of turmoil, Alden's clarion call penetrates the noise, igniting a spark of realization within the hearts of millions, and compelling them to seek shelter in the decentralized sanctuary of Bitcoin, where financial empowerment awaits.
The Fed is basically a council of elders that sits around and determines the price of money, right? And Bitcoin doesn't have that. It's an open network. And so right now, kind of for lack of a better alternative, all the countries in the world, and especially the periphery countries, are tied into the dollar system. And so they're at the whims of the Fed. They can loosen dollars.
In a world marred by systemic inequalities and economic disparities, Alden's revelatory words resonate, illuminating the path towards a more equitable future, where Bitcoin becomes the great equalizer.
But so far, kind of the key application of this technology is money. So Bitcoin and stablecoins are kind of serving most of the utilitarian use cases so far. And other things are basically changing how trading works, liquidity works, things like that. But a lot of it is really focused within that financial realm.
Empowering individuals to transcend the shackles of traditional financial systems. Against the backdrop of a shifting paradigm, Alden's prophetic voice rings true, capturing the imagination of a world on the cusp of transformation.
I think the long-term trend towards dollarization is clear. Basically, this kind of period is somewhat unnatural to begin with. If we have a country with 5% of the world population, but we're responsible for like 90% of international currency swaps, that's kind of a long-term unsustainable situation anyway. We've seen, for example, as India and China and the BRICS nations in general become a larger percentage of global GDP than the G7 eventually. That does result in an inherently more multipolar world, and that necessitates a multipolar currency world and a multipolar payments world so that one country can't just shut off payment systems of a country that's actually in some ways larger than itself. That wouldn't make sense. In the near term, I think some of these moves are, while they're happening, I think people might overstate the speed of them happening. So for example, de-dollarization is not really a big theme for my, say, 1 to 2 year Bitcoin outlook, but I think it does factor into, say, a 5+ year Bitcoin outlook. I think that kind of like how when you have de-dollarization, there's more interest in central banks in gold as an asset.
Record buying, yeah.
Exactly. I think so. Right now, Bitcoin is generally too small for most sovereigns. You have some smaller ones like Kingdom of Bhutan that's mining Bitcoin. They're able to kind of get into that space, but it's not large enough to be really a sovereign reserve asset. I think if you have another couple cycles of Bitcoin growth and you add to its market capitalization, to its liquidity, reduce its volatility, I think it could become a relevant sovereign reserve asset for some of these countries that want more independent, unsanctionable reserves that they can also use as unsanctionable payments. So I do think that Bitcoin is one of the solutions they can turn to, but right now it's, except for the smallest countries, it's still in many ways too small for these bigger sovereigns to fully take it seriously.
As the allure of Bitcoin grows stronger, drawing in a global chorus of believers, united in their quest for a decentralized and inclusive financial order.
Most people here have heard of Bitcoin Beach, right? So that, what was it, 2019 when they started? And they build this bottom-up community in El Salvador. And it's a small, circular Bitcoin economy where a large percentage of the population is educated on it. They understand it. The Bitcoins are locally held. And, there's been a lot of focus on nation-state adoption. And I think that's healthy. I mean, it's obviously a big sign of ongoing structural adoption when nation-states adopt Bitcoin. But of course, you can't impose education from top down. You can't impose buy-in from top down. And when we look at politics in general, grassroots movements are always more powerful than, like who has the most money for financing, for example. If the candidate's not right, it doesn't matter how much money you throw at it. And it's kind of the similar thing. If people don't understand Bitcoin, it doesn't matter if the government mandates it or not, or mandates its legal tender. And so I think nation states can do a lot by making it, not a taxable currency, but I think that actual adoption has to come up from these much smaller communities. And one thing we've been seeing over the past year or two, especially the past year, is that they've kind of replicated the Bitcoin Beach model, where you have Bitcoin Lake, you have Bitcoin Island, you have Bitcoin Jungle, right? There's little communities popping up in Costa Rica, Guatemala, Vietnam, Isle of Man. There's basically all these different little communities popping up, and I think that's only going to accelerate.
And so Bitcoin, I think, has the properties of being good money. And then in a market sense, as we discussed earlier, it's got pretty good scalability, especially when you look at it at a global sense.
The importance of Bitcoin that separates it from the others is a couple main things. One is that it doesn't pass the Howey test. It's not a security. There may be others that it's unclear if they're a security or not, but Bitcoin is the most clear at not being a security. So it's got a different regulatory framework basically any way you look at it. And then number two, in part because it's, part of what makes it not a security is that it's so decentralized. The way it was launched, the way it's designed, the limitations that it chose to have. Basically, it chose to be slower, it chose to have certain limitations in order to maximize decentralization. And so it's more of like a protocol, whereas when you look at other assets, there's kind of a spectrum. Some are more centralized than others. Some of them look almost like a company in a sense. Some of them are a little bit in the gray zone, whereas Bitcoin's more firmly in that protocol layer. So it's kind of like building on the internet. It's building on this somewhat more open system.
10 years time, I do. I think it starts with the smaller ones, and it also starts with any of these small countries that not only maybe want to hold Bitcoin, but they want to signal to Bitcoin companies that they're a friendly jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. So whether it's El Salvador or Switzerland or Liechtenstein or Dubai or Singapore, whatever the case may be, these smaller countries can say, we're a neutral ground. We're conducive to working with you. If, for example, the United States makes it a pretty hostile place, then they can gather some of that business. So I think there will be probably havens. Those havens might grow in size, or kind of medium-sized havens might also want to enter that market. But I think as you get a decade in the future, I wouldn't be surprised to see larger sovereigns own Bitcoin.
When we think of Bitcoin, we often think of it in a developed market perspective. We think of it as a United States person. We think of it as a European, for example. And people are like, why do you need Bitcoin? What is Bitcoin useful for? Whereas when you go to Argentina or Nigeria or dozens of other countries in the world, it's far more obvious why people need Bitcoin and why they might be interested in it, and why they might be interested in things like stable coins or things like ways to get US dollars, basically various types of harder money than whatever their local money is. And when the dollar gets super strong like it is now, the Fed is, increasing interest rates, they're doing quantitative tightening, and they're trying to rein in inflation. And the problem is that there are so many countries in the world that buy commodities in dollars, right? So they're having a much harder time buying commodities. And then a lot of them have dollar financing. They have dollar-denominated debts from European lenders, from American lenders, from Japanese lenders, from Chinese lenders. These, just dozens and dozens of countries in the world get squeezed when we do this.
One thing I'd recommend is even if your entity doesn't own Bitcoin yet or hasn't worked with Bitcoin, at a personal level, it's worth experimenting with. It's worth researching it, understanding how it works, and actually trying it, because that's what addresses that intangible aspect. If you interact with a mobile wallet or interact with a hardware wallet, if you send it to someone else, if you receive it, if you use it in an application, you earn it from playing a game, or you tip someone over Nostr with it. It can kind of open your eyes to the power of the technology. It's, a lot of analysts, when they look at it, they just see it as a price line on a screen. And it seems very intangible. And, they might not be able to differentiate at a technical level what makes Bitcoin different than Dogecoin, for example. Whereas when you actually, roll your sleeves up and dive into it a little bit, I think that's what informs people. And usually what I see at institutions is usually people in the ranks that have done that, on their personal life, that they have become familiar with the technology, and so they become kind of laying the seeds within their organization for why the organization might want to start looking at it, how this could be relevant to the organization rather than just themselves. So I think that's one thing really worth doing, is actually experimenting with the technology itself and seeing firsthand. You don't want to be kind of left behind as these things, evolve over time, and you're always looking at it just from a price standpoint rather than actually an interactive standpoint, because that can show you what works, what doesn't, what makes this powerful.
Bitcoin is becoming a top 5 or, probably top 5, definitely top 10 globally saleable money, which means that if you have Bitcoin, especially in urban centers of the world, reasonably tech-savvy areas, you can find someone to take Bitcoin off your hands a lot easier than you can for many other fiat currencies of the world. I mean, it's out of the 100+ currencies, it's getting up there, and the trend is obviously heading higher. And I think we're kind of seeing the same thing when it comes down to these individual communities that are building up, right? I think those are more powerful than top-down attempted implementations. I think the more people in a community that understand Bitcoin, get educated on it, and then they see it firsthand. I mean, basically, it's like you need a critical mass of merchants accepting it, people wanting to use it, people saving in it, and then you get that circular community, and you go to an underbanked area especially, and they get the benefit right away. And I think it's powerful.
Why does Bitcoin have any value? Why is something so intangible valuable? And a lot of that is addressed by stepping back and saying, if you look at the world, right? Again, in the United States, we're very privileged. We've been very safe. But there's a lot of people in the world that have to, cross borders, send payments across borders. There's 180 different fiat currencies roughly in the world. The long tail of those lose value generally very rapidly. You almost have this kind of like international barter system where, it works like money in their own jurisdiction, but, when they want to send or receive money to another jurisdiction, it goes through all these different frictions. And they don't really have a lot of alternatives. A lot of them, people in these countries turn to dollars, but then it becomes, where do you store the dollars? Do you hold physical cash? Do you dare stick it in the local banking system where, if there's a dollar shortage, it could be taken from you? There's all sorts of challenges. And so in those environments, basically Bitcoin becomes very interesting. And there's more of an incentive to, I think, learn and understand how it works and see why it's powerful. And when you think, what can you bring with you globally, right? A lot of assets are custodied by an institution. You can't bring a lot of gold through an airport. You can't bring a lot of cash through an airport. Whereas, Bitcoin represents this asset that is more mobile than anything we've experienced before. It's basically ownership of money in a decentralized cloud.
The interesting thing about Bitcoin as a technology stack is you can memorize 12 words in your head, and you have like your slot on this decentralized cloud of money that you can then go around the world and eventually reconstruct your ability to access that, right? Or you can just send it to people, peer to peer in a way that it's challenging to stop there are regulations and things that can try to slow it down around the margins, the fiat on and off ramps, but the actual network itself is rather interesting and kind of offers novel characteristics that a lot of other monies, basically haven't been able to offer.
So Bitcoin currently settles trillions of dollars worth of value annually. And even when you adjust it for, because, some of the money kind of comes back to, if you have an unspent transaction, it comes back to your own, where you sent it from. You can have that gross number that's, a little bit overstated. Even when you adjust for that, it's still very, very high. It's over $1 trillion and multiple trillions of dollars usually for annual settlement. And it's a huge network. And the interesting thing about it is that if you compare it to FedWire, which is the biggest settlement, infrastructure we have in the United States, it's basically, the Federal Reserve's interbank settlement system. Bitcoin and FedWire process approximately the same number of transactions per year. It's kind of funny how that works out. And you can kind of think of Bitcoin as the global open source version of that.
And one of the advantages of Bitcoin, it does have some shortcomings relative to gold. I'm more confident that gold's going to be here 5,000 years from now than Bitcoin, right? If I had to pick between the two. But what essentially Bitcoin does is comes up with a very scarce liquid commodity with its own settlement layer, and has those similar properties, but unlike gold, it can actually move about the same speed as fiat. You can settle it globally in an hour. With a Lightning Network, you can settle it seconds on smaller amounts. And so that's kind of where its niche falls.